Good day, students, and welcome to your hematology lecture. My name is Dr. Kasanga, and I'll be presenting this lecture. My office is BMS 912. Please feel free to come visit me if you have any questions about the topic, or you can email me on my email address over here. In this lecture, we will be discussing the characteristics of blood. So what is hematology? Hematology is basically the study of blood. It involves studying blood cells, plasma, blood proteins, platelets, blood clotting, and diseases related to blood. As future oral health care providers, it is important to have a good understanding of the blood. If you look at the composition of blood, 55% of your blood is made up of the blood plasma, whereas the other 45% is made up of your formed elements or your blood cells. So first let's take a look at your plasma. If you look at your plasma, the composition of your plasma, 90% of your plasma is water. Then you have some ions as well, such as sodium, bicarbonate, and chloride ions. These are very important for the osmotic balance of your blood, as well as for maintaining the pH of your blood. You also have some organic molecules in your plasma, so amino acids, glucose, lipids. Your amino acids are the building blocks of your proteins, your glucose for your carbohydrates, your lipids for your fats. So these are transported in your plasma. You also have some nitrogenous waste. So your nitrogenous waste such as urea, ammonia, creatine, and uric acid. And these are breakdown products from the metabolism of your proteins. You also have your plasma proteins, such as albumin, globulins, and fibrinogen. But we'll take a closer look at these plasma proteins in later slides. You have some trace elements and vitamins as well in your plasma. And then you have your gases, carbon dioxide and oxygen. About 25% of the carbon dioxide in your blood is transported in your plasma, whereas 1% of the oxygen in your blood is transported in your plasma. So let's take a look at these plasma proteins. So you have your albumins, which tend to be the smallest in size, but have the largest concentration in the blood. You have your globulins, which tend to be the largest in size, and then fibrinogen, which is somewhere in between. So if we take a look at the functions of your plasma proteins, your albumins are very important for carrying various substances in your blood. Now this is important because your kidneys don't filter proteins. So if a substance is carried by your plasma proteins, that means it won't be filtered out by your kidneys, and that substance will remain in the circulation. Your albumins also contribute towards the colloid osmotic pressure, and that's very important for making sure that water is reabsorbed back into your blood from your tissues. Then you have your globulins. They're important clotting factors, so that's important for when you have a cut to make sure that you don't lose too much blood. It helps clot. And then some of the enzymes in your blood are globulins. And then your antibodies. So your antibodies are very important for tagging pathogens so that your immune cells can recognize that this is a pathogen and then destroy that pathogen. So it's very important for your immune response. Your globulins are also important for carrying various substances in your blood. Your fibrinogen, it forms fibrin, which is a very important clotting factor, and we'll discuss fibrin in more detail when we talk about the blood coagulation cascade. And then you also have transferrin, which is also another important plasma protein, and it transports iron in your blood. So it carries iron in your blood, and it makes sure that your iron is not filtered out by your kidneys, so you can keep more of this iron in your circulation. And again, we'll talk about this in more detail when we talk about the red blood cells. So we can divide the functions of your plasma proteins into 6 basic functions. So firstly, they're responsible for your colloid osmotic pressure. And as I said earlier, this is the pressure that is responsible for the reabsorption of water from your tissues back into your blood. And this prevents excess water from accumulating in your tissues. And this excess accumulation of water is known as edema. So your plasma proteins are very important for preventing edema from forming. They also bind and transport substances such as metals, lipids, hormones, and drugs. And this prevents these substances from being cleared by your kidneys. So your kidneys don't filter out proteins, so as long as the substance is bound to a protein, then it won't be cleared by your kidneys. And then your plasma proteins are also partly responsible for the viscosity of the blood, so the thickness of your blood. And this is very important for creating and maintaining your arterial blood pressure. Your plasma proteins can also function as a buffer in the control of your blood pH, so they can accept both hydrogen and base ions in order to buffer the pH of your blood and prevent any fluctuations in the pH. They also protect the body, so through your antibodies, which can bind foreign pathogens and mark them for destruction by your immune cells. And they can also mediate blood clotting. If you remember, we mentioned fibrin and your globulins, which also act as clotting factors to prevent loss of blood when you have a breakage in your blood vessel. So that now brings us to the formed elements, or the other 45% of your blood. So these different types of blood cells that you have. Firstly, we'll look at the red blood cell, also known as your erythrocyte. It's this cell over here. Then you have your white blood cells, these different types of white blood cells. White blood cells are known as leukocytes. And you have the lymphocyte, the monocyte, the neutrophil, the eosinophil, and the basophil. And then lastly, you have your platelets. So these are what your platelets will look like. So we're going to take a look at these different types of blood cells in more detail. So your white blood cells are very important for your immune response. And your white blood cells can be split into two categories. Your agranulocytes, which are your monocytes, and your lymphocytes. These cells tend to have no granules in their cytoplasms. And then you have your granulocytes, which is your neutrophils, your eosinophils, and your basophils. And they do have granules in their cytoplasm. You can also note the unique shapes of the nuclei in your granulocytes. The nuclei in the granulocytes usually contain 2 to 5 lobes. You can see there's different lobes in the nucleus. Whereas your agranulocytes will usually have 1 lobe in their nucleus. Then you have your red blood cell, or your erythrocyte. It also has a very unique structure. It has no nucleus and it has this biconcave shape. So your red blood cells are very important for the transport of oxygen in your body. They can also transport carbon dioxide. And then lastly, your platelets, and these are just tiny cell fragments, and they're very important for blood clotting. If you look at the numbers of your blood cells, a healthy adult male will have about 4.5 to 6.5 million red blood cells in every microliter of blood, whereas a healthy adult female will have about 3.9 to 5.6 million red blood cells in every microliter of blood. So females tend to have less red blood cells than males, as testosterone is known to increase red blood cell numbers. Interestingly, the human body has about 37 trillion cells, and between 20 to 30 trillion of those cells are red blood cells. And this makes the red blood cell the most abundant cell in the human body. It makes up about 80% of the cells in your body. And this is because of the very important function of your red blood cells. It has to transport oxygen to every single cell in your body. And your body cells need a constant supply of oxygen in order to make energy. If you look at the white blood cell numbers, both males and females will have about 4,000 to 11,000 cells per microliter. And if we look at the different types of white blood cells, the neutrophils are the most abundant white blood cell, about 50 to 70% of your white blood cells, followed by the lymphocytes, 20 to 40%, your monocytes, 2 to 8%, and then your eosinophils, and lastly your basophils. And then lastly, if we look at your platelet counts, both males and females will have about 150 to 450,000 cells per microliter. And any decrease in this number of platelets would influence your ability to form proper blood clots. So now let's take a look at the functions of your blood. So blood has many important functions in the body, but the main important function of your blood is to transport substances around in your body. So your blood is the transport medium of the body. And the first important function that we're going to look at is respiration, and that's the transport of oxygen from your lungs to your tissues. So your oxygen is carried in your blood from your lungs to your tissues, and in your tissues your oxygen is used to make energy. And then the waste product of that energy production is carbon dioxide. And this carbon dioxide has to be transported back from the tissues to your lungs to be excreted from the body. Your blood also plays a very important role in nutrition. So the food that you eat gets taken to your stomach and to your intestines, where it gets broken down into its nutrients. And then these nutrients have to be transported to the tissues where they are needed to make energy and to build cellular components. So these nutrients are transported in the blood from your gut to your tissues. Blood is also important for the clearance of waste from your body. So as we mentioned already, carbon dioxide is transported from your tissues to your lungs where it gets excreted. But other products of metabolism can also be transported to your kidneys where they can be excreted in your urine, or to your skin where they can be excreted in your sweat. And they have to be transported in your blood to these different organs. Your blood also plays a very important role in thermohomeostasis, which is the maintenance of your internal body temperature. If the internal body temperature is increasing and the body wants to lose heat, the blood vessels close to the surface of the skin will dilate. Also, the blood vessel that's going towards your extremities, so towards your fingers and your toes, these blood vessels will dilate. So you'll increase blood flow to those areas, and that will cause you to lose more heat through radiation, so through radiation through your skin. If your core body temperature is decreasing and your body wants to retain more heat, then the blood flow towards your extremities and towards the surface of your skin will decrease. So these vessels will constrict and it will decrease blood flow to these areas. And that will keep more of your blood flow in your core where it's a lot warmer. So this is why people who are suffering from hypothermia, they might start suffering from frostbite in their fingers and their toes because there's less blood flow to these areas as your body tries to keep more of the heat in the core where it's a lot warmer. Your blood also plays a very important role in communication. So your hormones, which are secreted from your endocrine glands, travel through your blood to their target cells where they can have an effect. So this is very important for communication in your body. And then lastly, your blood is also important for supplying buffers. So it can transport buffers around in your body in order to maintain the pH of your body. It can control the distribution of water throughout your body, and it also plays a very important role in protection. So your white blood cells, which will protect against infection, and then your blood platelets, which aid in clotting, so it prevents you from losing too much blood if you have a breakage in your blood vessel. So your blood makes up about 7 to 8% of your body mass. For a healthy 70 kilogram adult male, that will be about 5 to 5.5 liters of blood, or about 71 to 75 mils per kilogram. An adult female of the same weight would have less blood, about 4.5 to 5 liters of blood, or roughly 65 mils per kilogram. And again, because males have larger amounts of testosterone, they will produce more blood than females. A newborn will have a lot less blood, about 300 mils of blood in their body. Several factors can affect your blood volume. So we've mentioned the difference between a newborn and someone that's an adult. So age can also influence your blood volume. Sex as well. So we mentioned the difference between males and females. Your weight can also play a role. The temperature, pregnancy, exercise. If you exercise frequently, then your body tends to increase your blood volume. Posture as well. If you're seated for a long time, your fluids tend to pool in the lower half of your body, which can decrease your blood volume. And then also altitude. So the higher above sea level you are, then the less oxygen that there is in the air. And that will cause your body to produce more red blood cells, which will then increase your blood volume. And then stress as well can also influence your blood volume. There are many variables that one can measure using blood to determine if an individual has any pathologies. Haematocrit is a common blood test to determine if the percentage of red blood cells in the blood is normal. So hematocrit is a measure of the percentage of red blood cells in the total blood volume. For males, a normal hematocrit is usually between 42 and 52%, and for females, it's usually between 37 and 47%. Again, because females have less red blood cells than males. So how is hematocrit measured? Well, firstly, a prick is made in the finger using a pin. Blood from the finger is then placed into a hematocrit tube, which is this thin glass tube. The inside of the tube is coated with an anticoagulant to stop the blood from clotting inside the tube. The blood is then centrifuged, so it's spun really fast, and then it separates into different layers based on the densities. So because your red blood cells are more dense than the plasma, your red blood cell will settle at the bottom of your tube and your plasma will be at the top over here. your white blood cells will be somewhere in the middle. So you can see here you have this layer of white blood cells in the middle. And then in order to measure hematocrit, you need a ruler. So you measure the distance from where your red blood cells begin to where your plasma ends over here. So this is your total blood volume. And then you measure just your red blood cells from where your red blood cells begin to where your red blood cells end. And you take this value of your red blood cells and you divide it by the total and you times by 100, and that will give you your hematocrit. So this is the equation for your hematocrit. You take your red blood cells, you divide by your total blood, and then you times by 100, and that will give you a percentage of your red blood cells in your total blood. So if this is a normal hematocrit, then this is what a hematocrit that is low would look like. And if the hematocrit is low, that would indicate that the patient has less than the normal amounts of red blood cells. And this condition is known as anemia. So when you have a low red blood cell count, that's known as anemia. If the hematocrit is high, then this indicates that the patient has polycythemia. So polycythemia is when you have a higher than normal red blood cell count. Polycythemia can also occur if a patient is dehydrated. So if you remember, your plasma is 90% water. So if you're dehydrated, then your plasma levels will go down. And that means that your total blood levels would decrease. And because of this, the percentage of your red blood cells in your total blood would increase, and that would give you a higher hematocrit than normal. So just to recap on hematocrit, for adult males, the normal is 42 to 52%. For females, 37 to 47%. Newborns will usually have a hematocrit of about 50%. If the value is higher than normal, that would be known as polycythemia, so that means you have a higher than normal red blood cell number, and this can be caused by dehydration, and it can also be caused by high altitude living. So if you live at a high altitude, then because of the low oxygen levels at this high altitude, your body's going to make more red blood cells. Remember, your red blood cells are important for transporting oxygen. So that will cause an increase in your hematocrit. And then if you have a decrease in your hematocrit, that's known as anemia. Another important blood cell variable is your erythrocyte sedimentation rate, or your ESR. Now your blood cells are more dense than your blood plasma. You can see if you look at the relative densities, so if the density of water is 1, then your blood plasma will be 1.03, and your blood cells will be 1.07. So you can see the blood cells are more dense. And because your blood cells are more dense, if you leave your blood to settle in a tube, your red blood cells will settle towards the bottom of your tube and your plasma will be towards the top of your tube. So this is just physics. Because your blood cells are more dense, they will settle towards the bottom of the tube. And this is known as sedimentation. So this is the principle of your ESR. For the ESR, we're interested in the rate at which your red blood cells will sediment. Your blood is collected in this thin tube that is coated with an anticoagulant. The tube is filled to the top with blood, and the tube is allowed to stand for 1 hour. The red blood cells will slowly settle towards the bottom of the tube, and after 1 hour, the distance that the blood has traveled is measured. If we know how far the blood will sediment in 1 hour, we will have the sedimentation rate. So this is your ESR, your erythrocyte sedimentation rate. So for males, a normal erythrocyte sedimentation rate is usually between 3 to 6 millimeters per hour. For females, it will usually be between 8 to 12 millimeters per hour. Because females have fewer red blood cells than males, then they'll tend to settle a lot faster, so you'll have a faster sedimentation rate. An increase in your erythrocyte sedimentation rate can be caused by an increase in your plasma proteins. It can also be caused by infection, tuberculosis, arthritis, or a fever. A decrease in your sedimentation rate can be caused by polycythemia. So if you have a lot of red blood cells, then they will tend to settle a lot slower, so that will decrease your sedimentation rate. Allergies, sickle cell disease, and hyperglycemia can also decrease your sedimentation rate. So the sedimentation rate can be affected by the structure of your erythrocytes and the number of your erythrocytes. So if your erythrocytes have an abnormal structure, such as in sickle cell disease or in rouleau formation, which we'll talk about in the next slide, it can affect your sedimentation rate, or the number of your erythrocytes. So in anemia, where you have very few erythrocytes, or in polycythemia, where you have a lot of erythrocytes, that can also affect your sedimentation rate. So rouleau formation is when you have these stacks of red blood cells, and this is caused by an increase in your plasma proteins. So when you have an increase in your plasma proteins, it causes your red blood cells to stick to one another while they're in your circulation, and that can cause them to stack on top of one another, such as this. And this can be very dangerous because it can cause blockages in your blood vessels, which can then lead to damage to your tissue. So because these red blood cells are already stacked like this in your blood vessels, that will cause an increase in the density of these cells. So if you have multiple cells that are stacked together, they're a lot more dense than a single red blood cell. And that will cause them to settle a lot faster, and that is why they will increase your sedimentation rate. So rouleau formation increases your sedimentation rate, and that's why an increase in plasma proteins will also increase your sedimentation rate, because it will lead to this rouleau formation. So that brings us to the end of this first lecture. And in this lecture, we looked at the composition of blood. So we talked about the plasma, which makes up 55% of the blood, and we talked about your plasma proteins in a lot more detail. We also talked about the different formed elements, so your different blood cells, your red blood cells, which are important for transporting oxygen, your white blood cells, which are important for your immune responses, and your platelets, which are important for clotting. And these formed elements make up 45% of your blood. We also discussed the different functions of your blood, and we mentioned that your blood is a very important transport medium in your body, so it transports different substances around in your body. We also talked about blood volumes and the different factors that can affect blood volume. We talked about hematocrit as well, and we mentioned anemia and polycythemia. And then lastly, we looked at the erythrocyte sedimentation rate. So thank you for joining me for this lecture, and in the next lecture we will discuss hematopoiesis, or how your blood cells are formed.